control in English society, and it's, for example, the topic of William Godwin's Caleb Williams. It is the central critique, the fact that the justice of the peace system is a landed system, and right the way up from JPs to Knights of the Shires to parliamentary legislation, the interests of the landowner are served by the law, by making the law and by implementing it.
And Parliament is meeting more regularly, and Parliament is more important. But why did Parliament decide to interfere with statute laws in this area, which had been accreting in its own way for 200 or 300 years beforehand? Why was this intervention? Do you want to talk about this, Rosemary?
Well, I don't think it was a decision on the part of Parliament. It was Parliament responding to pressure from people presenting petitions. That they're private acts, they're not public acts, they're private acts of Parliament brought by private individuals. And so Parliament as a body, the House of Commons, isn't making a decision that this is a policy that should happen. It's simply responding to requests for parliamentary sanction to give enclosure a kind of legal authority that it hasn't had before. And what's interesting is when Parliament starts actually to pass more and more acts, that enclosure, as we said, has been taking place for a very long time, and the first actual parliamentary act of enclosure was in the 17th century, but it's not until the 1760s that they really begin to pick up, and a lot of enclosure bills failed in the early 18th century. But what seems to change around mid-century is the chances of success become much more likely, and this, I think, is due to fact that parliamentary procedure is becoming more efficient, so fewer bills fall by the wayside, but also because there's increasing consensus that enclosure is important for the national economy.
Yes, I think the key point was that the law of Parliament, statute law, trumped common law, so that you could have enclosure by agreement or using common law within a particular community, but if there was disagreement or that there wasn't a uniform consensus, then Parliament, by enacting a statute, would override that and impose the will of the majority of landowners on the whole community. And this device of a private act to improve didn't just apply to enclosure, it applied to turnpike roads, to canals, and later on to railways. It was a device of enacting quite major change across the countryside or in urban areas relatively quickly, relatively easily.
Rosemary, can I come back to you? There's one way. Enclosures has a rather bad name in the general atmosphere of things, partly because of the power of poetry, Clare, Goldsmith, and so on and so forth. But for a lot of people, this was part of an enlightenment movement in farming. This was part of something that was going to be and was of great benefit to the nation eventually. And there was a mania for capability brown, redesigning, reshaping, and so on and so forth. Can you address that a little bit?
Yes, well, we tend to be now more familiar with the people who wrote against enclosure, as you say, because of very evocative poetry of Clare or even Goldsmith. But at the time, there was probably more literature produced pronouncing the benefits to be gained from enclosure. And there's some very effective publicists, most notably Arthur Young, who was the great agricultural writer from the 1760s onwards, who went around the country describing the progress of agricultural improvement. And he saw enclosure as a rational Enlightenment form of improvement, that it was obviously rationalisation. It allowed the consolidation of units of land. It allowed the implementation of what he believed to be more advanced agricultural methods. And it seemed to him that it was a more efficient exploitation of the land, that you got rid of this common land, which just was very often effectively wasteland, which wasn't efficiently exploited. This could be brought under more regular and efficient agricultural usage. And he very much associated it with the introduction of new crops like turnips and the introduction of a four-field rotation where you have wheat, roots, barley, clover. And so in his literature, he always compares the enlightened improving agriculture of the enclosed system with a sort of barbarism, and he uses the word barbarism to describe the unenclosed communities and the backwardness. And in the 18th century, people were very suspicious, very often, of unenclosed communities because they regarded the commoners as being really potentially quite subversive, that these were people who had an independence which could be a challenge to the
bold peasantry.
Exactly. That they didn't have to work for wages the whole time, therefore they could afford to be idle if they wanted to, and they could afford to be subversive if they wanted to. And so there's
we're talking about a time of
suspicion.
still the Jacobite rebellion, the 1745 invasion.
Well,
It's around, isn't it?
It's long-standing that. I mean, it goes back to the Civil War or earlier. The people who were most likely to take up arms against the king in the Civil War tended to come from places like the Fenlands, where you have a lot of communists.
Murray wants to jump in, and I want him to jump in, but I just want to nail... One second. I just want to nail the business of the improvements, because, again, just let's get it right before we move on. This was an enormous advance. The rotation, four-crop rotation system, the turnips and clover, it was a quantum... Oh, I'm not going to use that. It made a leap forward for agriculture. It was an agricultural revolution. Can you just nail that a bit more, please?
Yes, I think it was. Not everybody does, but I do. There were three things, really, that, from a practical farming point of view, that enclosure did. First of all, by amalgamating strips, by having more compact blocks of land, you were able to make sort of basic improvements like draining, for example. And the Enclosure Acts include stipulations about the land will be drained after enclosure. So you could improve the quality of the land. The next thing you could do, really, was to use the land for the purpose, in farming terms, for which it was most appropriate. One of the main points, if you like, about open field, common field farming was that it was geared to maintain subsistence. It was geared to maintain the integration of livestock and crops. It was geared to making sure that enough food was produced.
For the village.
I mean, food was brought in, but emphasis was on subsistence. Well, when you no longer need to do that, because the economy is more commercialised, because you have better transport, and you can bring in certain food, then you can switch the land over to more economically rational use. And this happened in two areas in particular. In the Midlands, you went more or less over to wholesale grass. Enclosure happened, no more arable farming, everything down to grass, cattle farming. And this was because essentially the land was heavy, grass gave you the most profit, so that there was a major change in land use, and villages would import food. In other areas, particularly light land areas, which had been rather farmed in a very extensive way, sheep walks and so on, you could then introduce these new crops and new rotations that Rosemary was talking about. It's known as the Norfolk four-course rotation, although the first place I've ever found it in the records is in Suffolk, but that's by the by.
It's known as... who live in Suffolk.
It's known as the Norfolk...
You've just cheered them up no end.
Well, indeed. They can be something new to be proud of. And this was really alternating grain with clover and turnips. It's really quite a sophisticated system, and it achieves a number of things that couldn't be achieved before. With the open field farming, typically you had a year of fallow followed by a year of wheat and a year of another cereal crop. So 1/3 of the land was fallow, which means not actually being used, not growing a productive crop. But with the Norfolk four-course rotation, you could practically actually remove fallows. So it made the land much more productive.
And meant you could store feed for winter, you could produce a lot more, the crop production increased massively, and by fencing in, the promiscuity of cattle could be restrained, and you could begin proper breeding.
Yes,
and which helped with all sorts of beasts. Murray Pittock, you've been sitting there so patiently. Do you want to go back 3 stitches or just carry on?
I'm quite happy to carry on. I think to say that
stitches agricultural reference.
Yes. the phrase economic rationality is always one which is I think double-sided. One person's rationality is very much another person's suffering, and things which are economically rational tend always to have byproducts in human change which can be unacceptable. I mean, I think I quite agree with Mark's point, and in many ways, one of the additional points really to make is that when you have a cooperative farming structure, this is one of the things that holds up, for example, the adoption of Small's plough, the affection plough in the late 18th century, is that actually, they all have to agree to use to get the thing and to use it, and it slows it down no end. If you have very large farms, obviously you can have economically
you can
rational.
Get plows, which is very important. That
you
technology.
can you can use byproducts. You can farm pigs because you can feed pigs on whey, which are the byproduct of making cheese. You can do all these things which you can't do on a communal farming basis. But nonetheless, the idealisation of the bold peasantry, which is not just a feature of Goldsmith's or Clare's writing, but is a feature of Gainsborough's painting. It's a big theme in the late 18th century. Is a view which is being taken because there are a lot of displaced people. There are a lot of people who are beggars as a result of being, in the end, not perhaps immediately, but in the end, driven off the land. The whole group of people who began as small farmers in the 18th century, whose descendants are agricultural labourers by the beginning of the 19th. And
the yeomanry was in effect displaced.
The yeomanry is effectively not destroyed, but largely destroyed.
How did this work out in Scotland? Because we hear Highland clearances and sort of a greater savagery appears to be there. Is this accurate?
Certainly, that the Highland clearances were carried out more from 1794. Were carried out a great deal more savagely. They were carried out in defiance of customary rights, which until the middle of the 18th century had involved actually fighting for the landowner. So, in a sense, the customary obligations, the feudal obligations, were much stronger, and so the sense of customary right was actually exceptionally strong as well. So, in the end, it wasn't perhaps surprising that violence was used. But when it comes to economic rationality, one of the interesting things about what happened in Scotland was that fertile ground was sometimes not used to develop for farming, but if the effort was too much, was used instead for deer. And by the end of the 19th century, like a tenth of Scotland's arable land was actually under deer. So it was being used as hunting estate for visiting sportsmen, for people coming up from England to enjoy shooting for the season and so forth. So actually the land use didn't always migrate towards farming. Sometimes it migrated towards leisure use, and I think the Highland clearances are a clear example of that.
But when you brought in the word English, as if the English is adopting their customary role recently as being the villains, but the Highland clearances were done by you could say it.
They were done by Highland landlords. Absolutely, they were done by Highland. The point is that they were done within the context of a British market which had a nostalgic vision of what it was to hunt in Scotland, using perhaps traditional methods, as by spearing salmon. Albert as Prince Consort was pictured spearing salmon over a Scottish burn. So I'm not talking about... so I think what we're talking about here is a market that became possible because of the existence of Great Britain, which was by force of population, not by force of inclination, largely an English market, which is the point I was getting at.
Yeah, absolutely. But in your notes, which one of lots of interesting stuff, was that the population of the Highlands has only now recovered from what it was at the mid-late 18th century.
It's in fact that's at best. It's quite possible lower than it was in 1750.
Can we take the population question to you, Roseweed? People must have wondered what was going on, because we were an agricultural country. We were still massively agricultural in 1800. I can't remember, 55%, something like that. People worked on the land. You tell me if I'm wrong.
No.
37%.
Well, you've probably got about 37%.
Oh, 37, 18, 55%. That's right. 55 in 1700.
Yeah,
that's right.
Yeah.
Still a lot. Now they're going away. Quite a lot of them are going away. Do people feel that the country is draining population because people are going abroad and so on and so forth?
Well, one of the reasons why people like Goldsmith or other critics were hostile to enclosure was the fear that it was leading to depopulation of rural areas, that they thought that people were losing their livelihood from the land, therefore would have to move away, and that they were moving to the cities. And Richard Price, in his observations on reversionary payments, is making this in 1771, is making precisely this argument, that he sees London in particular growing, and what he also is pointing out is that London is growing at a faster rate than it's reproducing itself. He's looking at the bills of mortality and showing that the number of deaths exceeds the number of births. So he's saying, well, where's this population coming from? It's coming from the land. It's the product of people being driven off the land by enclosure. And so London is eating up the population, and it's corrupting the population. It's creating an effeminate, luxurious, morally corrupt population. And all these independent, bold, sturdy peasants who would have fought in the navy or in the army are being lost and jeopardising the national interest. Whether enclosure really drove population growth in cities is an entirely different matter. Some people might have been released from the land after enclosure and they might have moved to towns. But the areas of greatest urban growth don't match up with the areas where there was most widespread enclosure during the 18th century. And what you're more likely to get is pools of unemployment in areas like the southeast where there was enclosure, because there's no obvious time for people to migrate to. Whereas the biggest towns which are growing most rapidly tend to be ports or places like Birmingham and Manchester, where migration, yes, it might enclosure might have contributed to it, but it's also internal population.